Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, Tyler Metcalf from No Ceilings joins us to talk about the Timberwolves draft and specifically Rob Dillingham, both as a prospect and his fit with the Minnesota Timberwolves. All things Dillingham and the Wolves upcoming with Tyler Metcalf from No Ceilings. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And today I'm going to hit a couple of quick draft things off the top, and then we're going to welcome in Tyler Metcalf from No Ceilings. Of course, Tyler is was a longtime writer for the Wolves at Canis Hoopus, worked with me before that at Dunking with Wolves several years ago, and he's been with No Ceilings. He actually did the postcast here. If you listen to postcasts regularly, he typically was the guest on the home game postcast, but did a few away games here and there as well. So Tyler Metcalf will join to talk draft. He is I would call him a draft guru. I don't know if Tyler, I think he'd like that. He's a draft guru. He really is. Does an awesome job at No Ceilings online and both YouTube podcasts and written work as well. So we'll get to that in just a second. First, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon at Fire TV, and you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at B Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right, so the Timberwolves, round 2 the NBA draft. They came into this thing with picks 27 and 37. Of course, we know they traded to get pick number 8 on Wednesday night in the first round. The Timberwolves retained their 27th pick. Or I should say the 27th pick of the draft, which they ultimately used on Terrence Shannon Jr. And then in the second round, they had pick 37, which they ended up trading out of entirely on Thursday night. So no pick to talk about. When we did the show Thursday, I thought there'd be a shot that they'd still have a pick. No, they traded back from 37 to 53, and then from 53 to 57, and then completely out of the first round of the draft. And I don't even know that there has been a reported return after that. So, and also I should say, with the 37th pick going to Detroit early in the day before the second round started, they also traded Wendell Moore Jr. This helps them get further. I shouldn't say they're not under the cap. So it helps them a little bit with salary relief by trading Wendell Moore Jr.'s guaranteed salary. We can quibble about should they have even picked up his option last October. Obviously, it looks right now like they should not have, but they didn't necessarily know they'd be in this exact spot now, so I understand why they did it. But all that to say, they had to give up 20 picks in the draft and ultimately all the way out of the second round just to get rid of the contract. You got to do what you got to do, and it hurts a lot less on the heels of the Rob Dillingham trade the night before than, say, I referenced this on Twitter, the infamous David Kahn trade back of 2011 when he traded back and out of the round and was raising funds to buy out Kurt Rambis and actually changed the way the NBA allows teams to acquire money for picks, putting a cap now on how much money teams can get for picks. That all changed because of David Kahn. So anyway, not exactly that, but the Wolves did not make a selection on day 2 of the draft. So we only have the 2 picks to talk about. And man, it was a fun first night of the draft for Minnesota. I thought they would just pick someone at 27 and that's all we talk about, but instead they trade for 8. They keep 27. So what I did with Tyler is we talked Dillingham for today's show. And then we talked about Terrence Shannon Jr., who the Wolves took at number 27 for Monday's show. So I'm going to save that part of the conversation for Monday. But today we're going to talk all about Dillingham and the Wolves. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into my conversation with Tyler Metcalf of No Ceilings. All right, I have Tyler Metcalf of No Ceilings with us. Of course, Tyler is also part of our Locked On Wolves postcast team this year over at Locked On Sports Minnesota. And Tyler knows a lot more about the NBA draft than many of us who mostly just cover the Wolves, but Tyler does both. So he's the perfect guest for us because he's covered the Wolves and the draft. So excited to have you on, Tyler. And like the conversation I want to have today is all about Rob Dillingham. Of course, the Timberwolves trading up into the number 8 spot in the draft on Wednesday night, the first round of the draft of the 2-day I don't know that we want to call it an extravaganza based on what Thursday's draft looked like from a TV perspective, but Rob Dillingham of the Kentucky Wildcats, the Wolves get him at 8. They give up a pick swap in 2030 and a top 1 pick swap in 2030 and an unprotected 2031 pick to San Antonio. Talked a little bit about Dillingham, actually a lot about Dillingham on the last couple shows here at Lockdown Wolves, but I wanted to get your thoughts. A couple things, certainly overall, Dillingham, and then also your thoughts on his fit with Minnesota. What should expectations be early on for somebody like this who was not even a starter on his college team? Not that that was his own fault, but like stepping right in to a conference finals team, what could he contribute in year one? So we'll start with just kind of an overall, like if you were just kind of giving I guess an elevator pitch on Rob Dillingham as a prospect, what are the highlights? Like what are the things that make him such an intriguing prospect and ultimately made him a top 10 pick?
He's arguably the best just pure bucket getter in this entire class. He is on the smaller side, 6'1", like 165-ish, give or take. So he's tiny. He's a really small dude in terms of NBA standards, obviously. But he has something that the Timberwolves don't have. We saw how stagnant and lifeless their offense got in the playoffs, especially against the Mavs, where Anthony Edwards was the only guy who could just go out and get a bucket out of any situation. Rob Dillingham was arguably the best in the entire country and this entire draft at doing just that. He did it on ball, off ball, at the rim, from 3 in the mid range. And then he also has a lot of creativity and playmaking to his game for others. So there is that legitimate translation to being more of a point guard and not just a 6'1" shooting guard, which is always tough. So he's fun, man. If he was 6'4", 6'5", he probably would have been the number 1 pick. That's
what I was going to say is that's the first thing that stands out is the size. And defensively, like it seems like, I guess we could start there. I hate to start where he's maybe lacking a little bit, but it's related to the size. Cause I think that's the primary reason why there's some concern with him defensively. It seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he had some pretty good moments on the ball, pretty good moments, point of attack, where it's not a lack of effort. It's more of a lack of size and strength when it comes to navigating screens and maybe some technique things that should get cleaned up, need to get cleaned up at the next level. But if any team was going to have somebody, an undersized point guard, I mean, the Wolves were a really good defensive team with 37-year-old Mike Conley, who's obviously bigger and skilled and a veteran, but also like Jordan McLaughlin on the floor, right? Like they were still a really good defensive team. So the Wolves should be able to absorb having a smaller point guard on the floor as long as he's giving them that effort and it cleans up some technique at the point of attack. I mean, is that close, or what are your thoughts on him defensively?
Defensively, he's probably going to be a disaster. The bright side is, he did have a steal rate of like 2.5.
Yeah.
So there is some sort of defensive playmaking aspect to his game. And if he can maintain some of that, I think it'll be enough to balance with the offense. He's never good. I would be stunned if he's ever a plus defender. But if he can just not get played off the floor, and opposing teams in college did that a couple times this year, most notably the Gonzaga game, they went after him relentlessly on the defensive end. So he's small. I think he kind of wants to defend. Some of the gambling and jumping passing lanes and defensive playmaking stuff is encouraging. But he also looks like a guy who's never been taught how to defend and never been asked to defend. So when you get that combination in a guy with his physical stature, the end result is pretty rough. And that's kind of what we saw most of the season. I would enter this season with zero expectations for him on defense, but kind of like you alluded to, for that minute span before the trade was announced and San Antonio picked him, I was like, I like it because they have that defensive infrastructure. They have size and length around him. And then the trade got announced that he was going to Minnesota. And it's like, all right, these feelings are the exact same. He's going into the number 1 defense in the league from last year, basically from start to finish. They have a ton of size, a ton of athletic, versatile defenders around him. And it's not like their small point guard, who started basically every game, was the leading catalyst for their defense. So if there's a team who could find success despite having a small, defensively inept point guard, it's the Minnesota Timberwolves.
Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Game Time, our title sponsors. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. Really anything you want to attend. It's not just baseball either. It's not just sports. It's also concerts, comedy, theater, all of the above. Save up to 60% off buying last minute. And I am a procrastinator. So if I need a ticket to anything last minute, I'm definitely going to use Game Time for their last minute deals. You can also save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event with their flash deals. They also have all-in pricing that you can toggle on. It shows you your total up front with no surprise fees at checkout, and they have the lowest price guarantee. If you think you find a better price elsewhere, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Yeah, and for a player like that is so talented offensively, and you mentioned, he may have never really been asked to defend, or at prior to getting to Kentucky, he maybe didn't need to apply himself that much defensively. You wonder how much there it could be contagious, joining a team like the Wolves, and you hope that that's true to an extent, and I mean, given the size limitations, it's very rare that a 6'6" player in the NBA becomes a plus defender. So that's fair. I think hopefully there is that level of like, all right, well, if everybody else is getting down in a stance and doing this, I can too. And the steal rate popped out to me as well as something that was encouraging. At least I don't know how much of that was gambling. I didn't watch enough of his full games to know if that was something that happened too much, but it at least shows that there's some like knowing where to be at the right time, to his game, and certainly offensively, which I want to get into quite a bit on that end of the floor. That's actually a pretty good segue, because something that popped out to me, like we'll talk about the shooting, which is awesome. The catch and shoot was crazy last year. The handle is probably the best in the draft, or is the best in the draft, really. The touch is great. But the thing that surprised me the most watching a bunch of his tape was something that nobody was like. I saw a couple of scouting reports that were floating around out there that were like, oh, well, the passing accuracy needs to be better and things like that. And then when I was watching him, I was like, you know what? That might be true. But the fact that he's getting to some of these looks with the ball in his hands as a one and done guy at Kentucky, like reading the defense in the way that he did, but then also beyond just reading the pick and roll, which is one thing, but like the feel of like, all right, I've got this guy on my hip, I'm going to shoot a floater, I'm going to stop and pop a 15-footer, or I'm going to fake that, and then this guy, sags in, and then I can hit the guy in the opposite corner. Like those sorts of reads to me felt really next level. And if it's just a matter of improving some of the accuracy, it seemed like the timeliness was good. For as much as the ball was in his hands, the turnover rate was really quite low. So that to me stuck out as something that isn't getting talked about enough, that I think plays immediately in the NBA.
I never understood the playmaking concerns with him, because when you look at the numbers and ratios, I mean, he had an assist to turnover ratio of 2.0. That's fantastic. Assist rate of 30.1, turnover rate of just 15.6, and that's on a usage rate of 29.9.
Yep.
So he had the ball all the time. He's creating a ton, not turning it over. I've never understood those concerns, because when you watch him play, there's a sense of craft and creativity that very few players in this class really possessed, where when he's getting blitzed in the pick and roll, he's taking a couple extra dribbles to drag those defenders with him to free up his teammate a little more. He's changing angles to avoid defenders with his interior passing. He's tossing lobs, making skip passes. I love the playmaking. I really think there's a legitimate and very quick path for him to just playing as a point guard. But I think one of the reasons that we saw him more in that shooting guard role this year was, one, Kentucky had DJ Wagner and Reid Sheppard, Reid Sheppard was very good. And two, the big question with Rob coming into this season was, can he actually contribute and play winning team basketball? Because in high school, he spent a year at Kanye West's Donda Academy, which was an absolute disaster. Then he went to OTE, which has produced some solid basketball players, but their commitment to modern NBA-esque, college-esque style of basketball, and that, doing the little things at a high level, it's not necessarily there. And a lot of his tape was like just highlight culture stuff where you flip on the highlight reel and he looks awesome, but then you watch everything in between and it's like, what is this decision making? What is happening? And then he goes to Kentucky, and Calipari did a fantastic job of just kind of reining that in while still letting him explore that creativity in his game. So as a point guard, the playmaking, I have almost zero concerns.
Yeah, the playmaking really popped to me, and especially, I mean, like I said, I was surprised when that was a concern, because there are people who immediately, there's very few people that it seems like out there did not like the trade, but there's some concern's a strong word, but I saw a little bit of it floating around out there on Twitter, like, oh, well, he's a shooting guard and you already have Anthony Edwards and he's undersized, but the playmaking is really like, in a sense, it made me think of, and I guess this gets into a little bit of the next thing I want to talk about, and we'll get back to some of the offensive stuff, I think, along the way. But that role that the Timberwolves really want off of their bench, and, go back to Jalen Noel and how much Chris Finch obviously really wanted him to be kind of a microwave off the bench. That was he would frequently mention him as like a member of the core. He had a really good year, and then 2 years ago was awful and, isn't really in the league anymore, at least not permanently. And then last year it was Shake Milton, and he was awful in a Timberwolves uniform, despite having been pretty solid in Philadelphia before that. This is like the same idea where it's a combo guard who can initiate offense, but can also get his own shot. He's a better shooter than both of those guys. Now, I mean, he only played 1 year of college, but he was, I think 38% off the dribble is what I have down, at 48% on catch and shoot threes on 88 attempts this year, which is not a tiny sample. So he could get his own shot off from anywhere and he can make it, and he can catch and shoot off the ball. And that seems to fit really, really well with either running the bench unit as like, hey, this is your offense, or it's like you and Nas that need to score. Or you're going to play with Anthony Edwards because Ant's going to run the bench unit, but you can play off the ball and just knock down open threes all day when Ant's on the floor. It just kind of seems to be that same Noel Shake-esque role that the Timberwolves keep trying to fill. And clearly he's got more juice and obviously a lot more upside than either of those guys.
Yeah, that's it. He can play on ball, he can play off ball. And he showed that all year. And when, just to go back into some of the synergy numbers, 97th percentile spotting up, 89th percentile pick and roll ball handler, 57th percentile isolation, 58th percentile off screens, and spot up, the distribution of the play type frequency. Spot up and pick and roll ball handler were both about a quarter of his possessions. So he's playing a ton on ball, he's playing a ton off ball, and he's incredibly efficient at both of them. And he's creating for others and using that scoring gravity to really manipulate defenses and draw them into, different spots to create for either himself or teammates. His recognition speed, his processing speed, combined with his creativity, it just really was a big reason why Kentucky's offense was putting up like legit NBA-esque numbers, and why he was one of the most electric scorers and just all-around offensive creators in the country. On our YouTube channel, I broke down a bunch of his film from this year, and I would just to highlight the different areas of how he can impact the game on and off ball. And a lot of it's sets that we see for the Timberwolves run a lot, between horns action with him on ball and off ball, running off a stagger screen, floppy action, all that kind of stuff is legit NBA actions. And he's finding a way to contribute wherever he's placed in that set.
Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Yeah, and you mentioned all the different play types that he's succeeded in. I mean, he shot 50% as a pick and roll ball handler, 43% on threes out of pick and rolls. Like, all that stuff is stuff that the Wolves are going to do, and to give them somebody else besides Anthony Edwards that on the perimeter can create, like, I think there's clearly doesn't have the size of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but there's obviously more. And I know coming out of college, Alexander-Walker was thought of as like, hey, could he develop more? But that's already there for Dillingham. Like, he'd already do all this stuff, and he immediately can kind of be that. Like, I don't know that he's, we could talk a little bit about this. I don't think he's going to immediately like be the sixth man, because you're still talking about a conference finals team that has Naz Reid on it. That's going to get plenty of opportunity. But I just think the offensive game is so well-rounded. The floater game, you don't often see somebody that truly is. I know the finishing in the paint was maybe a little bit spotty, and he's small, but he's crafty, and he's got such good touch that he really is somebody who could score if the floater range, also mid-range jumpers if he needs to. He could also knock down threes. We talked about that. I think the scoring in the paint will still be fine, even with his size, because of the touch he has and how crafty he can be. And it's very rare to find somebody that can do all of those things coming into the NBA. And I mean, you started with this. Like, if he was a little bigger, he's probably the best player in this draft, kind of hands down. And he was already kind of a consensus top 10 pick. But yeah, I think the fit with the Timberwolves is really, really perfect given what they were looking for. I think now from a Wolves roster standpoint, we'll talk more about this next week as free agency opens, but surely the Timberwolves, and we'll also talk here about Terrence Shannon Jr. and the Wolves didn't end up making a pick in the second round. Clearly they're going to bring in another guard on a vet minimum deal. It could be McLaughlin again, but it seems like the plan is to basically say, hey, between you and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, like, you guys are going to run the show off the bench for us this year. It seems pretty unlikely they're going to go spend the mid-level on Monte Morris or somebody like that that's going to need a little bit more than the minimum.
Yeah, in the kind of post day one pressers and everything Finch and Conley are saying, it sounds like he's playing a lot right away. So there'll be a learning curve and all of that stuff, and Finch will have to be patient through that learning process and those errors and let him kind of learn on the fly, which we haven't always seen. But we also haven't really seen Finch come in with rookies of this caliber. So, the rookies that haven't played have been second rounders or very late first rounders for the most part. And the young players with some pedigree, with some real juice to their game, Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, he's played them a lot and let them experiment and let them learn and let them process. So I think that's going to be the plan with Rob, is just, we're going to throw you out there in a lot of different situations. You're going to be running the second unit. You're going to be playing off ball, off of Ant. Probably, I bet we see some Conley, Dillingham pairings occasionally too. We saw that with Morris and Conley down the stretch. So if they go like three bigs out there, they'd be weird having 2 6'1" guys and 3 near 7-footers. But there's some really cool and fun and creative things that this Timberwolves roster can utilize, because Dillingham's just bringing an offensive spark to the overall rotation that they just simply did not have last year.
All right. Anything else that we didn't get to on Dillingham that you want to point out? We talked already about the defensive concerns, but is there anything we missed that we want to leave the people with?
Yeah, you kind of touched on it, but just real quick with the at-rim stuff. He's tiny. It's going to be more of a struggle in the NBA, obviously, than it was in college. At Kentucky, just 52.6% overall at the rim, but in the half court, that was up to 58%. So it's one of those weird juxtapositions where he was much better in the half court than in transition. We typically see that flipped, but he also has that really reliable counter of that in-between floater. And this year, 53% on the floater. That's a really high number, 88th percentile in points per shot on the floater this year. So he does have that counter already kind of established in his game. And he's also really comfortable throwing lobs. So as he continues to develop, I think there are a lot of counters there where he can kind of toy with drop defenders. And yeah, he's small. Finishing around the rim is going to be a little more inconsistent than it was at Kentucky, but there's a lot of craft and kind of counters available to his game that should hopefully nullify that long term.
All right. So this is part one of our conversation. We talked about Dillingham, of course. On Monday's show, we're going to air the second part of our conversation talking about Terrence Shannon Jr., not the actor, Terrence Shannon Jr. on Monday. We'll talk about that here in the next conversation with Tyler. All right, so there you have it. Tyler Metcalf on Rob Dillingham, one of the newest members of the Minnesota Timberwolves. Lots to like there. And I mean, I don't know. There's so much upside offensively for Minnesota now and for the bench unit almost overnight. We're going to talk about the other reason for some optimism, Terrence Shannon Jr. on Monday's show. My conversation with Tyler, we did another 15, 20 minutes talking about Terrence Shannon. We also talked a little bit about, at the end, about what the Wolves may or may not do in free agency. Of course, there's not a whole lot of options. In fact, we're going to run this Monday. I'm just kind of assuming that the Timberwolves aren't going to do anything crazy there won't be anything crazy that happens over the weekend in the legal tampering period that opens on Sunday. By the time we do the show Monday, I would imagine that Shannon conversation will still be able to run then. If anything else happens, if there's anything else major, we'll of course shift that around a little bit on Monday and early next week. And of course, we'll talk lots of free agency. But at the end of Tyler and my conversation that will air Monday, we did talk a little free agency, what the Wolves may try and do related to slow-mo and the mid-level exception. So lots to get to there. We'll talk more about that next week. We covered it a bit on the Minnesota basketball party this last Wednesday. If you missed that, it's on YouTube on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. Also, that episode posted the audio. Myself, Reggie Wilson of Care 11 and Ron Johnson, the Ron Johnson Show, and also Sam Ekstrom of Locked On Sports Minnesota. That posted like Wednesday, late afternoon, early evening, shortly before the draft. So if you missed that episode, go check that out this weekend or today, Friday or this weekend. We did talk some free agency at the end after some of the draft talk. So go back and check that out. And again, lots of free agency here on the show next week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at B Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.